Thanks very much. It's wonderful to be with you on a beautiful Friday and also to be able to share some good news. This time we don't have to stir the pot quite as hard to find some good news about the economy. I want to start by a very quick shorthand summary of where it appears we are for the national economy at the midpoint in 2013. So half the year has passed. And when we look at the economy and how it's performing at a middling rate of GDP growth that seems to be diminishing right now. When you look at GDP growth for the economy, the most recent official numbers show something like 2.4% real GDP growth. Those are the most recent published Department of Commerce numbers. But then those organizations that sort of try to take a pulse reading on a continuing basis tell us that maybe we're at 1.8 right now. Summary says this year is going to show 2%, maybe 2% plus, so that you could say if you liked 2012, you really ought to be happy with 2013 because it tastes very much like the same kind of year. The interesting feature of what is going on, and we'll look at this a little more closely as we get going, the interesting feature of the economy is that construction, which is a large and has been a lagging sector, and because of that has been punishing economic growth, that sector is alive, it's getting well, it's looking pretty good, particularly on the housing side. And so as a matter of fact, across many market areas, real estate agents are having some of the best years they have had in years. Lots of closings, lots of bargains out there. And one of the bargains has to do with the extraordinarily low interest rates which have been prevailing for some time. And so you had, I guess, the best mix of all for a fire sale. Housing prices plummeting because of a sharp decline in demand and bankruptcies. That's the sad part of the story. But housing prices plummeting and interest rates plummeting. And so you had the wonderful opportunity to buy something cheap with cheap money. And so people have been taking advantage of that. And so now we see housing prices picking back up, housing markets tightening. And then on top of all of this, while the Fed has promised to continue to pump money into the economy and continues to do so, their most recent announcement, which came yesterday and the day before, was one that was a little more cautious, saying, no, we're not ready to put our foot on the brakes, but we're hunting for the brake pedal. And so as a result of that, those who seem to be able to interpret data and tell us exactly what's going on, those commentators said that's why we've had a sell-off in equity markets, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And so I think this morning things probably picked up a little bit better. But to summarize, we still have a slow economy. The prospects for speed are not very bright. But even an economy like ours, when it's growing slowly, is producing a lot of new wealth. But it's not being spread as far as any of us would like to see it spread. So to get us into the story, I invite you to think about this picture in front of you. I'm sure every one of us has had the experience of flying down an interstate highway at 70 plus miles an hour and then seeing a sign that says, "1 lane closed ahead, slow down." And that's what you see. And as you slow down, you really slow down. How many of you have had the experience of almost being in a parking lot, a horizontal parking lot on Shirley Highway or on one of the interstate systems? When I was commuting to Atlanta for about 10 years, living in that area, I used to see men over shaving. You know, we'd all be parked. I expected to see someone giving a shampoo to the person in the car with them because there would be long delays as we waited for traffic to begin to move again. But have you ever had the horrible experience of slowing down like this and you look at your gas gauge and you've got 1/8 of a tank and you've stopped and you were planning on filling up the car at the next major intersection and you don't know where it is. Have you ever had that knot in your stomach as you look at the gas gauge and then you see the warning light turn on and you're wondering if you're going to make it? Anybody ever had that terrible experience? I have. And so there you are in park, and while you're having that experience, have you ever had a Good Samaritan show up and you're desperate, and someone shows up with what we in my part of the country call a Georgia credit card? The Georgia credit card is a piece of hose that enables you to siphon gas out of somebody else's car. And so someone shows up with a Georgia credit card, and then another person says, I've got a little extra, I'll give a gallon. And so, in a sense, you reverently thank God, and you get some gas in your tank, and you say, when I get to the next intersection, I'm going to pay you back. And so, there they are, filling up your Saab, putting in a little bit of gas, and now you know you're going to make it, and you get to the next intersection, and you pull into a station, and you see that. No gas. Well, now, if you've ever experienced that, and I doubt anyone in the room has had all of this happen to them at one time, if you do, then you understand how our economy is doing. You understand how the economy is doing. That is, we are on an economic expressway that is capable of 3 lanes of activity, but only 2 lanes of moving. And we're running on borrowed gasoline. We're running on borrowed fuel. And the day has to come when we pay back those people who are lending us the gasoline that's fueling our economic engine. So when we think about that in our discussion, we're operating with 1 lane closed, we're running on borrowed fuel, we're still getting there for some sectors, and we want to talk about those. And of course, we're looking for prosperity. And then as sort of a side feature of the discussion, should we get there, we'll talk a little bit about a public choice interpretation of IRS and antitrust and FEMA selective activity across our economy, and see what the public choice scholars might tell us about the behavior of these and maybe a few more agencies as we attempt to use the logic of economics to explain political decision-making and activity. And so here's our reading of traveling on this 3-lane system, but traveling with 1 lane closed. The blue line running across this chart is the norm for our national economy over many recent years. And the norm says our economy normally is running at 3.1% real GDP growth, but we're not there. We're at 2.4. And so we've lost 1% of the growth rate. That's the closed lane. Now the difficulty is we've only been above that blue line 1 time in recent years. Just once did we get above the blue line. Now there's a long, long story associated with all of this, and we won't delve into the long story. The real question for us always is, where are we at the margin? What can we say about tomorrow? Now we can learn from the past, and sometimes that helps us to make a better statement about tomorrow. But what can we say about the prospects? And as we look at this line, I look for optimism everywhere I can when I'm examining economic data, and so I'm thankful that that line seems to be pointed north. But it may turn down next quarter. But in any case, you can see where we are and where we would like to be. Now, as we delve a little bit deeper, we can look at a sort of report card on what real GDP growth has been like per capita. When I say the economy is producing real wealth, new wealth at the rate of 2.4%, that's for the entire economy, counting all of the people that are in it. But if our economy is being filled constantly with more people, and it is, then we have to ask, well, what is the GDP growth per capita? Because obviously one way to have more GDP growth is just to have more people and employed. And if they're producing the way people have always produced, just more people will get us more real GDP. If they're producing at a higher rate, that makes GDP get even better. And so if productivity goes up and you get more people, you get more GDP for 2 reasons. And so now we're putting it in per capita terms, and so I ask you to look at decades. Back the decade of the 60s, it was 3.14. That's the old norm. The next decade, it's falling. It's 2.11. It stays in the 2+ range. And when we get to the most recent decade, it's 0.66 per capita. That's pretty pitiful. Now, we know that included in that is the Great Recession. Included in that number is the effects of the Great Recession. And so the next entry, I show you what it was like before the Great Recession hit us. It was 1.99 on a per capita basis. And so this gives us a reading in a sense of not only we're on a highway with one lane closed, but for some reason we're not able to produce wealth the way we once did on per capita terms. And that sort of begs for a diagnosis as we think about that very pitiful number. One way to diagnose the problem is to look at real GDP growth. That's the yellow brick road in the chart. To look at real GDP growth and as a potential, and then to look at what it really is. That's the white line. Potential GDP growth is a term that is based on an analysis that says, let's assume that the economy is operating at a normal level of unemployment. Well, now, right now, our unemployment rate is 7.6%. And the normal rate of unemployment is 5.5%. And so a statistician can look at GDP growth rates in the past and says, well, now I'm going to assume that we have 5.5% unemployment, and then I can announce what real GDP potential would be. That's the yellow brick road. Now, you see, we fell off the yellow brick road. There's the Great Recession. But as you see, that white line is running almost parallel. Once again, you're seeing the closed lane. It's not turning up. It's not heading back. It's running parallel. Now, sadly, I would say, it's not turning back. And so there's our gap. Caught up in the gap are lots of unemployed people, lots of firms that still have not reopened, still have bankruptcies, but at a decreasing rate because things are getting better. So my optimistic twist on this would be to predict that that white line is going to start heading north this year and next, as though that gap is going to be closed, but notice it has a long way to go. Now, those are the barrels saying one lane is closed, and now you're seeing it in economic data. Now let's look at another dimension. The yellow line here is real personal disposable income for the nation. We look at what people earn on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, and we subtract from that the taxes that they pay, and then this is how much you have left over to spend. That's disposable income. And that's the yellow line that you see. The red line is real personal expenditures. Okay? There's a gap between those two. Normally, that gap reflects savings. You don't spend every last dime that you earn, so we have savings. That's included in the gap, but there's something else. And so now you're looking at what has happened, and notice that the gap has widened as between real personal income and what we spend. The gap is getting wider, has gotten wider. Now I have taken that real disposable income and I've subtracted from it transfer payments. Now we're looking at a society of people who every month get a paycheck that includes their earned income, and for many of them, they get another check that's an unemployment benefit, a Medicare benefit, a Medicaid benefit, a Social Security disability benefit, and also some retirement income. Money they made in the past that now is paying off. And so now when you look at this white line, we've taken real personal disposable income and have subtracted from it all of those transfer payments. And when we look at this, you see the gap between the white and the yellow line has widened substantially. That's the borrowed gas. That's the borrowed gas that's supporting a level of expenditures, as you can see, that's running pretty close to earned income minus these transfer payments. It seems to tell us that the American people are not stupid. I've always thought that's the safe assumption to make when you're doing an economic analysis, because if you say, oh, they're stupid, well, that explains anything you want to explain. This says, hey, they've got a pretty good idea of where their money's coming from, and so that says, be careful, friend, because those transfer payments are temporary, some of them. Part of them are my retirement benefits, and in a sense you'd say, that's okay. But that other part that's temporary, I better be careful. And so the difference between those two lines, part of it is that can of gas that we borrowed from somebody else, and in a sense we're borrowing it from ourselves, and that's the Medicare fund, that's the Medicaid fund, that's the Social Security Disability Fund, which the trustees say will run out in 2016. That's 3 years from now. That's the Social Security Fund, which they say will run out in 2036. That's the Medicare fund that the trustees reported 10 days ago will run out in 2024. All right. That's what's in the tank. That's what's in the gas. And those funds are feeding us and keeping us going. So then we have to think about this gap. What is this gap that we've got? That is, when I pull off and try to replenish the gas in the can, will the pumps say no gas? Where's the gas going to come from? Now this is showing you another version of how the American people are faring. I'm showing you two relationships. The white one is personal interest income. The yellow one are government transfer payments. So government transfer payments have accelerated, as you can see, during the Great Recession, and we understand why. Those are the unemployment benefits, the disability benefits. By the way, Social Security Disability, the Social Security Disability Program, when you look at it and see what it is a very wonderful program when you look at the boilerplate and how it's designed. This is for people who were employed and due to some accident or some difficulty that affects their health and their well-being, they can no longer hold down that job, and they apply for Social Security Disability, and they receive something like maybe 85% of what their earnings were, non-taxable, coming out of the Social Security Disability Fund. During the Clinton years, that accounted for about 3% of the total employment in our nation. In other words, about 3% of the total employed was receiving Social Security disability benefits. That rose to 4, and then 5, and now 6%. It has doubled as a result of, I would say, the Great Recession and the difficulties posed by it. Now, typically, those people who go on Social Security Disability don't ever come off. I mean, what are the incentives if you're getting 85% of your pay and it's not taxable? And so there is a moral hazard problem. That is what we refer to in the field of insurance as moral hazard. Moral hazard, Uncle Jack insured his shack and now he plays with matches. All right. The presence of insurance induces behavior that would lead to more payoff, more cost. And that's why you can never buy a fire insurance policy for your house that will cover 100% of the loss. Otherwise, there would be more people burning down their houses. You can insure up to 80%. So if you set fire to your house, you're going to be paying for 20% of it yourself. And so the disability program has an element of moral hazard in it. Every form of welfare that we might invent has some element of moral hazard. But the difficulty is what I mentioned earlier. The disability fund is running out of gas. Now, the white line tells us what has happened to a lot of retired people who were counting on interest income to pay their monthly bills. As the interest rates have plummeted, their income has plummeted. And so we have a distributional effect that we can see here in the chart. Those people who were retired on fixed income, that had saved, and they had put their money in CDs and insurance funds and elsewhere, counting on having a flow of interest income to help them through their retirement years, they are disappointed. Those who are on different kinds of support, usually thought to be temporary, are doing okay, but we've gotten a fire alarm that says, whoops, be careful. We're running out of gas. Now, that's the summary of some items out of the news. Social Security Trust Fund to run dry in 2033. Medicare finances improve modestly. Secretary of Treasury Lew urges long-term fix. Federal Disability Fund on the brink of running out. It runs to zero. That's 2014, 16, 18 is when that fund runs out. So those are, sorry, no gas. Those are the realities. And it's not the first time we face these kinds of realities, and usually it has to get pretty serious before somehow the political process leads to that kind of coalition that would give us a fix. But there's a tendency for us to say, well, why should I worry? What's the expression? The worn-out expression, let's just kick the can down the road one more time. We'll get a fix for the next 3 or 4 years. That'll keep us going. And then maybe that will postpone disaster. And that's sort of where we are. Now here's some good news. Federal government receipts have more than recovered to pre-recession levels. And so the money coming into the till is filling up again, and it's looking pretty good. And as a matter of fact, it has gotten so good at the most recent interval that the Treasury is actually, for the first time probably in 7 to 8 years, is paying off some debt. A little teeny bit of it is getting paid off. Because the revenue is really looking good. Now, two sources, or one source of that revenue is from Fannie Mae, paying a dividend of about $65 billion to the U.S. Treasury, and that's related to housing coming back, construction coming back, and so we've got a pretty big chunk of cash flow that's coming into the Treasury as a result of that. But nonetheless, I stand before you bringing you a little bit of good news. That is, the government's paying off its debt instead of adding to its debt. And when you look at that slide, say, wow, let's see if we can find some more like that. Oops, I'm sorry. This is the bigger picture. Also looking at the same data, you can see that the revenue receipts are rising above where they were, the yellow line, but, oh, there's the expenditure line. So it's still yawning. So as we think about the borrowed gas, whether we can repay it or postpone repaying it, and then saying, okay, what's this picture for the fisc, the federal fisc? Well, here's the picture. And that leads us to the unfortunate situation of either one or two choices or a mixture of the two choices. Get more revenues, cut expenditures, and of course that's what you live with constantly in doing the good work in the legislature. That's what we confront. Now one argument is, well, let's raise taxes. tax the rich and the greedy, not the needy. These are the signs that we see. Raise the rate on those who earn at the very top end of our economy, and that will solve our problem. Now, what I'm showing you here is the top federal marginal income tax rate historically considered. It goes back to 1954 when the highest rate was 90%. It comes forward not quite to 2012. I think we get to 2011, not much change there, where the highest marginal rate is about 35%. Now, when you look at that chart, and if I were to ask, now what do you think federal revenues look like across this same period? What do you think federal revenues look like? Does it look like this? High rates, high revenues, tax the rich, it's going to get us out of this hole. Or does it look different? What's the picture? What is the statistical relationship between the highest marginal rates and the revenues that come into the till? Because remember, our challenge right now is to get revenues, not to get tax rates, but revenues. And so that's the question. Well, here's what that number looks like. This is federal revenues as a percentage of GDP from 1954 through 2011, and it's pretty much a flat line. So the flat line says, who are you kidding? It doesn't matter what you set as tax rates. Well, I ask you, well, what in the world is going on? How is it that you can have tax rate as high as 90% and you don't get any more revenue? That's a share of GDP. That's when you have tax rates of 35%. Please, somebody tell me what's going on. Why is it that the gears do not mesh? Anybody have an explanation? You got one.
People change their behavior to pay a certain amount.
Incentives matter. And so you decide to postpone those capital gains. Say, hey, I'm going to wait this thing out. Maybe I can outweight the tax rate, and I won't sell those appreciated assets. And so all of a sudden, capital gains, returns go down. Say, well, instead of paying myself a salary, since I own this corporation, I'll pay myself another way, in shares of stock. And so I will avoid. And since that tax rate at the margin is so high, I think I will hire a couple of other tax attorneys. And so they get real busy, and the accountants get real busy. Unfortunately, the economists don't, because they don't know how to help. But people begin to engage in tax avoidance. Well, I'll just leave that income in another country instead of bringing it home. All kinds of behavior is induced. But the lesson here, across decades, the lesson is, if you think you're going to get more revenue by raising marginal tax rates, please think again. Because the story seems to say, not just in our national experience, but in the experience of other countries, if you want more tax revenue, get the rates down and cover more taxpayers. Try to get more people putting money into the till, because these real smart people that make a lot of money at the tail of that distribution, they can dance and skate and escape that tax rate. And so it's running at about 18%. No matter what we do. And this is part of the discussion that is going on now as we look at this problem. Well, what's hot? Let's talk about some of the good news in the economy. As I've indicated, when we're growing at 2.4% or 1.8%, this is a big, big economic engine. And when it has a positive growth rate, even at 1.8%, it's generating lots of stuff. Let's look at some of the stuff. There's retail sales. Running through March of 2013, notice how these bars, the most current ones, are way above where we were in the Great Recession. Fully recovered, expanding. That means that a lot of restaurants that were shuttered have reopened. Main Street's a little more lively than it has been. A lot of those outlets in the mall that had crepe in the windows have reopened, or somebody else has reopened. Retail sales are picking up. Now, the yellow line is pointing to the cash for clunkers effect. That's one program, Cash for Clunkers, that caused retail sales to explode. In our conversation a minute ago, we said incentives matter. You better believe they do. If you pay people to buy automobiles, guess what? They're going to get out and buy automobiles. And you stop paying them, well, you can look at the next bar. When you stop paying them, they stop buying them, and you kind of get back to norms. So here's good news. Retail sales looking very, very healthy. Now, this is machinery, equipment, and supplies. Look at this. It's almost exploded. Something like we have not seen in recent years. This is new machinery, new equipment. This is going into mining, gasoline production, gas production, all kinds of manufacturing activities, bringing a lot of new machinery into the picture, and one of our major exports, machinery. Housing starts. The most recent observation, as you can see there, is for February. If I had the ones that came out last week in this chart, it would be even taller. We'd be up close to the 1 million line. There's the norm. That's the long-run norm in terms of housing starts, about 1.6 million annually. Notice we're not close to it, but we are headed in that direction. Every step of the way generates more activity for people in drywall, painters, plumbers, air conditioning people, people building houses, people building apartments. Rental-type construction is exploding now relative to ownership-type construction. But if we say, okay, when do we get back to the yellow brick road? If we continue at the current rate, and here's your naive forecast that says the future will look like the immediate past. When we fit that line to those most recent observations, now we can make a forecast as to when we get back. And there it is, 2016. That's not that far off. So this is now a driver for our economy that's going to get us above, I would say, the 2% growth rate, the 2.4 that we have been experiencing. Well, what about employment? Well, we're not back. We can play the same game and say, when will we get back? The recovery is rather steep, but we're not back. And 2014. Hey, that's next year, if we continue at the current rate. So we have a healthier employment picture, but it's not nearly as healthy as the picture we saw on housing, the picture we saw on retail, the picture we saw on industrial machinery. Now here's manufacturer shipments. Fully recovered. Fully recovered. This is the manufacturing sector. All right. No more sackcloth and ashes for these guys. Well above where it was in terms of output. But there's employment. Notice that right now, let's see, where are we? In terms of total employment, as you look at this chart, the blue arrows that I'm showing you indicate what happens to total employment each time we have a recession. I'm showing you 2 recent recessions. You get a sharp drop-off in the number of people employed in manufacturing. What did we just say about manufacturing output? Remember? It's fully recovered. It's above where it was. But employment in manufacturing is well below where it was. And not disappearing. Notice it is headed up a little bit. It's headed north. But you can see a large drop-off from where we were right about there in 2007. Big drop-off in total employment. Big increase in output. What does that say? Large increase in productivity. It happens every time we have a recession in our history. You close the most inefficient plants first and you do not reopen them. The cost of labor is rising, not wages, but the cost of labor is rising because of fringe benefit costs, not because of wages. Wages are flat. But cost of hiring is going up. The cost of robots going down. Robots are getting cheaper. Labor's getting more expensive. Forecast, more robots, less labor. Wherever robots can be used. They are used primarily in auto manufacturing in world markets. BMW's plant in South Carolina has 25% robots, 75% labor. They are predicting that in the next 10 or 15 years, those ratios will reverse. It'll be 75% robots, 25% labor. Now that 25% labor may be as many workers as are working now because that plant continues to expand and get bigger and bigger and bigger as the world cannot seem to get enough BMWs. So it's a bright picture there. But as you look at robot utilization worldwide, it's rising because labor costs are rising and robot costs are going down. So we will see more of this. But notice this thing is picking up, and that gets us to this topic of reshoring. It's always fun when we invent a new verb. All right. We are now reshoring. We hope. Some people hope that some of that labor that went to another shore is coming back here. Now, it's hard to find the evidence for that, but you can find some things that look like it may be evidence for that. And part of it is in this slope that you see, this upward slope in these last observations. In fact, if you look back over a long series of a chart like this, you don't see this kind of increase. So notice we're coming out of a slump and picking up. So which industries? What are the industries that seem to be picking up as we go forward? To get a handle on that, I'm showing you the percentage change in value added by manufacturing. And as you look at this, you can see some lines that have increased markedly. Oil and gas, booming. Slowing down, but it has been booming. Mining support. Durable goods. All right, those are the hard-hitting ones. Non-durables down below it. Another look at the same thing, I'm showing you where wholesale trade is that sort of corresponds to this. There it is. Another look is quantity indices of gross output by industry. If you stare at this chart, the year 2005 is set at 1, or if you want to say 100, notice all those bars are the same height. And so the construction of this chart says we'll use 2005 as the base year. Any bar higher than the base year will be a growing sector. And so you can see as we come forward bars that begin to shoot up above the 2005 level. And here, the most recent year, 2011, there are your hot industries: steel, aluminum, computers and electronics, machinery, and aircraft. Those last two are major export items. And so part of our speed right now is related to that. Here's natural gas reserves. This is just giving you an eye as to where in the United States there will be another boom in manufacturing that relates to the presence of cheap energy. That's where it is. These are the industries that are very sensitive to the price of fuels. So we can begin to pick the industries and the locations. Now, everybody's looking for prosperity, no matter where they might be on this wonderful earth. And one of the most salient measures of outlook for any state or region has to do with whether or not people are choosing to come there or to leave. They are voting with their feet. Any state in this map that is dark green is enjoying a large net influx of population, people voting with their feet, and you could say, oh, they're all stupid, or you can say, no, they're not stupid, they know what they're doing, and they love Texas. They're going there. That's not the only dark green state. North Dakota must be wonderful. They tell me it gets cold there, so if you are liking the Dakotas, you might want to go to South Dakota. But North Dakota is the fastest growing population state in the nation. And you can see some that are lighter green. Any state that has a population growth rate above 1.7%, that's the national average, is the darker green. And as you get down into the southeast, where I spend a lot of time in my studies, you can see that some of those states are a little darker green than others. Alabama and Mississippi are losing population at a rate, that is, their population is growing less than the national level. There are more people leaving than coming in to push it up above the national level, and then you have a different fortune. This is percentage change in personal income. And again, there's North Dakota sitting up there, nice and blue. These colors match pretty closely to the population growth because, again, if you want to produce more GDP, if you get more people working in your economy, you're going to get more income. And this is state employment growth. I've colored yellow the southeast so that you can see the variety just in that region. And there's North Dakota. When I'm speaking to students at universities, one of the questions on many minds is, where should I go and look for employment? And I show this chart. Go to North Dakota. And that always pauses. They always pause and they say, well, what about Virginia? But North Dakota is where it is in terms of employment growth and so forth. And of course, that's an energy-producing state. A little bit in the way of forecast. In the material that you have in front of you, you will see a measure of output for the nation, two measures that are generated by the Institute of Supply Management. The one on the left up here is for manufacturing. That number wants to be 50, and it's not 50. It's below the 50 line. That says manufacturing is shrinking in the U.S. right now, primarily because of Europeans' economies in a sink. So you can see what has happened as we approach the present. The manufacturing sector has gotten weaker, much of that, again, driven by Europe. But there's another part to our economy, a bigger part than manufacturing, and it's the services economy. That's 80% of our economy, services. And notice, services economy was headed south, and in the most recent observation, which came out 10 days ago, we're back headed north again. A healthier part of our economy is the services sector. And then there's a group that turns out something that is more of a forecast based on surveys of manufacturing. And so it's the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity Improvements Index of Outlook. And notice it's got a little bit of an optimistic tilt to it that suggests that our national economy will be doing better in the last quarter of this year than it is doing now. Now, as our economy has warmed up, I enjoy, when I'm traveling, I enjoy getting out early in the morning and going to some of these really big filling stations. Isn't it amazing how big they have gotten, some of them? You know the ones I'm talking about? There's a chain that comes out of Texas that is called QT, Quick Trip. Maybe they have 40 pumps out front. I expect you could get an appendectomy in there if you were willing to wait. All kinds of food, meals, carry-outs. When Dot and I go out for dinner, maybe we're celebrating an anniversary, we'll go to a QT, get us a hot dog and sit out in front and look at the people who are coming through. It's a pretty good way to celebrate an anniversary, particularly when it's your 59th, which is where we are. But here's an index that I've put together based on what I see at these filling stations. I'm seeing a lot more pickup trucks. And the pickup trucks represent a recovering economy. So I decided to just track pickup truck sales relative to light cars. And that's what you see here. Here are the autos, the yellow, and there's the white. Those are the pickup trucks. So I call this my F-150 economic indicator in recognition of the Ford F-150 because it is the #1 selling vehicle in America, period. All vehicles considered. We Americans like to drive trucks for some reason. And when we drive trucks, we appear to like the F-150 better than anything else. And so we see this acceleration. So I wanted you to see this last piece of good news. Now we are approaching the time where I should stop. Perhaps you said, well, that was 40 minutes ago. But let me pause right here and see if you have questions about what we've talked about thus far. And any questions about the economy, things I have brushed up against, maybe things that I have not? Yes, sir.
On the state employment growth chart?
Yes, sir.
Several states are yellow.
Yes, sir.
Reason for that?
Only one state is losing. Michigan is the only state that has a loss of population. You ask about employment.
Employment growth.
Let me take a look at the employment.
Southeast states?
I'm sorry. I colored those yellow just so that you could see how the variation across one region. You can see the variety with respect to one region. Virginia has negative there. Virginia is the only one of the southeastern states that's in the negative category. You're seeing very high employment growth right now in Florida, for example, but in a way it's because Florida really hit the skids, but there's some really good recovery in that state right now. Another question? Yes, sir.
You'd mentioned that we would be back in terms of private employment by 2014.
Yes, first quarter.
Do you have a sense as to what that, or what the actual rate would be, unemployment rate would
The unemployment rate will be higher than it was when we slid off when we got on the sliding board. That is, if you go back to December of 2007, which is where the Great Recession starts, you would be looking at an unemployment rate in the 5+ range. We're not going to be in the 5+ range. We might be in the 6+ range when we get back in the first quarter of 2014. Remember, right now we're at 7.6. It nudged up a teeny bit from the previous month's 7.5, so we're bouncing right in there. The unemployment rate has been improving, but the workforce has been expanding somewhat. More people age to the point of entering the labor force, more people seeking. That's going to cause the unemployment rate to be higher because the labor force itself has gotten larger, but working against what I just said is a falling labor participation rate. And so a lot of people who were previously in the labor force, before the recession, no longer count themselves in the labor force, no longer count themselves unemployed. They're doing something else. They may be disabled, that's part of it. They may have just decided, I'm going to live my life a different way because it's so hard the other way. I can't find work and I'm just going to stop looking. So you call those discouraged workers. But you put all that in a churn and stir it. My forecast is that we will be looking at a higher unemployment rate than we saw in 2007 when all this started, but it will be lower, and we will be back with a labor force employed that's equal or better than what we had when we slid off. But it's been a long time. That's 2007. We're talking about 2014, 7 years. So there will be a lot of discouraged workers. There will be a lot of people who are on the sidelines doing something else. And in many cases, they're making a living. There has been an explosion of firms with one employee in our economy. And that may be somebody who's gone in the landscaping business. Call it cutting grass. But they're making a living, and you respect them for it. Another question? Yes, sir. Yes, I would say it definitely could. And the question here has to do with it as we think about the demand for labor in the manufacturing sector and the supply of labor that can satisfy entry-level requirements. That supply is disappearing. Now, I don't mean that sounds bleak. It says, hey, there won't be anybody applying for work that is fit to be hired. It is getting extraordinarily difficult for manufacturers, the ones I talk with, and it's a good cross-section, to find people who can take entry-level jobs and there is a 3 or 4 way test. Drug-free, no criminal record, high math and verbal skills. That's the entry-level person. At one of the largest DuPont plants in the nation, I was talking to the superintendent of that plant recently. They bring in 100 people in a search to fill jobs, 2 out of 100. They have to pull in 100 to find 2. Entry level. And so, long answer to your question. It's one of our critical issues. A lot is being done to try to address it, but the robots are there. In a sense, the robots are there, and they don't have drug problems, they don't have a criminal record, and they know how to read. I don't know whether they know how to write, but they can do a lot. But it is a trying problem. But markets do adjust, and we'll see adjustments occurring there. Somebody else had a hand up. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the housing market being in a positive outlook, and you also touched on Fannie and Freddie.
Yes, sir.
What do you see Fannie and Freddie as more borrowed gas? What do you see as the future of the housing market and GSEs now that they're in control?
Okay. A good question, a tough question. That is, the question has to do with our government-owned enterprises, as they're called, GOEs. These 2 big ones, government-owned enterprise, Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae. Something like 95% of all the mortgages being made in our economy now are being financed by a government-owned enterprise. That is, it may be Wells Fargo or BB&T or you name it that originates a mortgage, but they package those mortgages and put them into mortgage-backed securities and sell them, and Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae ends up being the holder of those debt instruments. And of course, Wells Fargo or BB&T gets some money back and they can lend again. And of course, with this recovery, as I indicated, there's big positive cash flow in those government-owned enterprises. The politically scary part of it is because of past behavior. If it says past behavior is going to give us a forecast of future behavior, there's a dose of moral hazard here. Housing policy has historically in this country, since the Homestead Act in the 1800s, housing policy has been a wonderful political plum to be used to improve the well-being of people and to make them happy and to love me and to vote for me. So it's always been that way. And so we will predict, I would say, with certainty that Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae will be leaned on politically to open up the valves, reduce your lending standards, make it easier for these mortgages to be made. And that says, somewhere out there in the future, we'll have another housing bubble or a problem. Perhaps that's enough of an answer to indicate to you that I think there's something to be concerned about there, but in the present, I don't see that kind of pressure being exerted at the moment. But the risk is there. Another hand? Yes, sir.
You expect higher interest rates, and do you think that will negatively affect the recovering housing market?
We've got the 30-year mortgage rate is at 4 now. It's up about 0.5 percentage point just in the last 4 weeks or so. The 10-year government bond is at 2.4. It's gone up from about 1.7. That's a big percentage increase. Huge increase. So we have a sudden rise in those rates. I don't think that kind of number will slow the housing market. It will slow the refinancing of housing. There has been a huge amount of that activity. A lot of people who had a mortgage saying, good lands, I've been paying 5, I'm going to refinance and I'm going to pay 4 or 3.5. Gee whiz, what a huge reduction in my monthly payment. That's been going gangbusters. That activity is slowing down to a trickle. But if you get out to the original buying of homes, homeowners who are going and talking to a realtor, a 4% 30-year fixed rate plain vanilla mortgage looks pretty good, but you've got to have a pretty good down payment to get that mortgage. So I don't think higher rates will hit that in the head. The difficulty with higher rates, the larger difficulty I would suggest, is down with Secretary Lew and the Treasury Department. Because right now the interest rate on our debt is 2.19%. That is, we taxpayers are paying 2.19% on that huge amount of national debt that is sitting out there, and that is really cheap. As interest rates go up, that one goes up also. So as it goes up, the interest cost of the debt begins to eat into other parts of the federal budget. Now, it'll have to go up a good bit before it eats such a large chunk that we then have a compounding of the problem of cutting spending or finding more revenues. But that is the more difficult part, I think, of the interest rate increase. Maybe time for another question, but it's 1 o'clock and I don't want to wear out my welcome any more than I have already. Yes, ma'am.
Will the sequester play any role in stopping or putting a damper on the economy?
The sequestration, you know, as we look at politics through the lens of economics, that's the only lens I have. I've got bifocals and only 2 of them are economics. I don't know what the others are. Maybe they're sociology. I hope so. But as we look at political behavior through the lens of public choice and we look at something called a democracy, which is not real neat, is it, in terms of making decisions and grappling with really difficult issues. But we can say reverently, thank God we have it. Thank God we have a democracy. But it's not real neat. I sort of think that the sequestration, you might say, as blunt as that instrument might be, is as good as we can do to hammer away on getting control of the deficit. In my newsletter, I tell the story of a sign that I saw in an executive's office that said, "Measure twice, cut once." That was a man who was the CEO of a stainless steel fabricating company. Stainless steel is expensive. And they had a rule. Always measure twice before you cut. Or measure once, cut twice. No. Politically, we don't measure at all, we just cut. All right? Because we're a democracy. We're not real good at measuring, and we're not really good at cutting, but we got to cut. And so I'm thinking that may be the best we can do. Now we're tweaking. We're tweaking, and the politics enters the tweaking. When the air traffic controller said, hey, we're not going to be letting any more planes leave the major cities in the country, Congress did what? Whoa, 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 we're going to tweak that one. But when they said we're not going to have any more tours of middle high school students in the White House, they didn't tweak that one. So what is politically important is going to bear, and the sequestration, I think, is giving us maybe some direction as to where we might be heading, but we're going to need several more like it, I expect. But thank you so much for your kind attention. It's been wonderful being with you. Thank you for what you do in your work. Good being with you.